This is Parkinson's Awareness Month, and we'll be talking with someone who has a personal experience with Parkinson's disease. Zack Briggs works for KENS TV in San Antonio. I've known him for a couple of years, and I invited him on to talk about his career in broadcasting, the different places he's been over the last decade that he's been in the business, and his time in San Antonio, and Parkinson's disease, and how he has a personal connection. Zack Briggs, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today on our podcast.
Yeah, hey, Chris, my pleasure.
It,
We've
it
known each
almost,
other for a couple years now, it seems like.
we have, yeah, definitely. And in this, we almost had to reschedule our podcast. Your station, you were going to go to Arkansas. Can you tell me a little about what was going on?
Yeah, so with KENS 5 TV in San Antonio, and there was a tornado that was very destructive in Arkansas, and 600 people injured, but a couple dozen people were sent to the hospitals. But just the images were just very surreal to see, and that's my previous market. I worked in Little Rock, Arkansas for a couple of years, so corporate for the station I work for now asked me to potentially go help and assist with tornado aftermath, and I was ready to go. I had my bags packed, but then I got the call to stand off because I guess they have the help they need from places that are a little closer to Arkansas. So I was prepared to go help and be perhaps with old coworkers of mine and buddies, and at the same time doing the news on the aftermath of the tornado. But I'm sticking around.
You said you worked there for a while. Was anybody that you know personally, affected, injured by the tornado?
No. This tornado seemed to be concentrated on like the west part of Little Rock. I mean, I've seen on social media how some of my coworkers have come across damage not too far away from where they live, like just a bunch of tree limbs down, just debris everywhere. It's a mess, and it's something that I'm thankful that no one that I knew was injured or had significant damage to their homes. But I believe there have been at least a couple deaths as a result of this tornado. And seeing the images of the town of Wynne, Arkansas, which is a little closer to Memphis, Tennessee, that town, or parts of the town, were just obliterated. And I've covered at least a couple tornadoes. I think there was one in Jonesboro. I was with a photographer with the station I was working for at the time, KATV, Channel 7 News, and we went to this town, and it was just horrible to see how people's lives were turned upside down, and be able to tell these stories, talking to the people that are impacted. And I don't know if I would be so gung-ho to talk to someone or even have any desire to talk to a reporter. I just lost my home, but there are people that are willing to share their stories, and speaking with them on their desire to rebuild and somehow having the strength to move forward. And I like hearing those stories.
But I kind of want to take a little back trip a little bit and just kind of hear where you hail from, growing up, your family, what that was like, as a child.
Yeah, so I grew up in Washington State, Eastern Washington, a place called the Tri-Cities. People think of Washington State and they think of the lush green evergreen trees of Seattle, for example. But I'm from a more, I guess, desert plateau area. Pasco, Richland, Kennewick are the three towns, and sometimes I count Hanford because kind of an interesting tidbit that Hanford is where, back in the days of the Manhattan Project of World War II, they produced plutonium for one of the bombs that was dropped in Japan to ultimately end the war. So that's interesting. They have tours and everything, but it's a place of many stories for sure. People coming out with reporting some type of illnesses, etc. So, but again, I'm a big history guy, especially when it comes to World War II. So I've been to the Hanford Museum and got a tour of where they supposedly produced the ingredients for a bomb that was dropped in Japan. Over 150,000 people, I believe. And every time I go back, it's something. There's a new hotel, a new restaurant. It's ever growing. But yeah, I'm an only child, so every time I go back, it's a big deal, I guess. Not only for me, but for my parents and my grandmother that lives across the street.
What age were you when you decided, hey, I think broadcasting is the direction I want to go?
It's kind of hard to pinpoint an age, but I've always loved writing as a kid, and more fictional than anything. And I grew up reading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings books, and I would write my own adaptations of the Tolkien world, the world of Middle Earth, or I'd just, with my friend during recess, we would write on college ruled paper. Instead of playing outside occasionally, we would stay indoors and write our own stories about, mainly in fantasy settings. I think some of those stories still exist. I might have converted them, some of them, to like a Microsoft Word on this old Windows 95 computer that I had, but I think that was disposed of at some point. But watching news was always a big deal in my home, whether it was simply white noise or on while eating dinner. We'd dedicate our time to watching local news and all of the networks, the 24/7 networks, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN. I'd watch them all. And at some point, as I got closer to graduating from high school, certainly years before I did graduate, because I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to get on with my life and start working. This desire to write and this curiosity about the world and communities and how I could tell stories about what's going on eventually turned into me going to Washington State University and graduating, finishing off my associate's degree and doing 2 years at WSU and getting a degree in communications, emphasis broadcast journalism. So when I was a kid, my uncle used to be in the business, no longer is anymore. Okay. He was into the sports world, though, so I'm not a big fan of sports except when it comes to college football, WSU. The days of Mike Leach are probably my favorite. But attending this invitation from my uncle to see what he does at KTLA in Los Angeles and seeing the process of going from the makeup room to the studio, which was all I got to see, was interesting. I was pretty young, but I remember seeing everything, and there's this interesting glamour about it. But I think that was also a slight aspect as to why I wanted to get into the broadcast side of things, not for the glamour bit, but just be able to use my voice and be able to tell stories in that medium. Radio, another form of broadcast, was something I was also considering, and something I still consider to this day, pursuing one day. But yeah, I mean, I've been in the business now since 2014. I started out in Helena, Montana, and that was fantastic. I was at a bureau station. The main station was maybe 2 hours away in Great Falls, and I was thankful to have veteran reporters at this bureau station. I'm kind of surprised, for a bureau to have kind of a sizable staff, a newspaper reporter, former newspaper reporter, and a guy that had been in TV and radio for decades. And I was always being helped by them and asking questions, because without them, it would have been probably a little bit more of a challenge to develop my skills and as a journalist, from video work to writing. But Helena was a great opportunity because I enjoy covering politics, and that's the capital.
Mhm.
A smaller town, so it was easy to get there. And wildfires were one of the more common breaking news type stories. It doesn't seem like I've covered more wildfires than when I was in Montana. Then I was very grateful for the people I've met in Montana. And then, this business seems like people have this goal of moving up, getting to larger markets. So 2 years later, I'm in Tucson, Arizona, and that was fantastic. I worked for the NBC station there, NBC affiliate. More wildfires, different kinds of wildfires, and just a general assignment, city, county government, and anything in between, really.
Right.
But most recently was in Little Rock, Arkansas. And there, another capital city, enjoy capital cities, more politics, being in that environment. I think one of the more prominent stories I covered, I just kind of still think about, is the floods. There was a massive flood from about and through the Arkansas River, and devastated communities, small homes lost, people's lives forever impacted. So again, the natural disasters tend to lend themselves to doing many stories of showcasing how people can come together in tragedies and try to rebuild, and through faith or whatever. I mean, they do what's needed to overcome and conquer and try to move on in some way. And those are people stories are vital to showing people around the world how communities are impacted and how they unite in times of tragedy. So then I've been in San Antonio. I joined at the beginning of the pandemic, which was very unique. For the first year, interacting with coworkers mainly over Zoom or WebEx, or there's so many of these programs these days. Blue Jeans by Verizon, we're using currently, but it was a kind of a challenge, I would have to say. I mean, being a new employee, wasn't the only one, that's for sure, and starting out at a new job is interacting with folks through video conferencing. But for the first year, I was working as a nightside reporter, so we always got photographers when we worked nightside. And KENS 5 is the CBS affiliate in San Antonio. Mm-hmm. And I got to have that privilege and luxury of working with wonderful photographers and the other nightside reporter, nightside team, and lots of stories about the pandemic. So many angles, very devastating, obviously, throughout the world, including here in Texas. The hospitals across town is struggling to keep up with the demand and be able to accommodate enough beds for people that are on their last legs of life. People of all ages, really, not just older individuals or people with prior health conditions, people that were seemingly healthy,
right,
severely ill, even died. And done plenty of those stories, and you're never desensitized to death or to people that have fallen ill, because each person has a family, friends, community members that care about them. And it's been a tough road for sure for a lot of people during the pandemic, including the health workers, first responders, and journalists. So I've enjoyed my time here in San Antonio. I'm in my third year. Well, I've been 3 years in June, so we'll see what's next. But my passion still lies with telling stories in some fashion.
Coming to a new city, having to know the geographic area, learning, finding a place to live, meeting new people, finding out the way the city works. I was just curious if that first story in that new city stands out at all for you in any city.
Yeah, it doesn't really stand out to me. I think I was just flooded with the the challenges of the pandemic and everything. I'm sure it was something COVID related, COVID-19 related, and that of itself, despite not knowing, certainly impactful. But I'm pretty sure it was something to do with COVID-19. My previous markets, I can't really. I could actually recall in Little Rock, my first assignment was it was a shooting of some sort that took place at an off-campus student housing complex. But this is somewhere, I think it was Conway, Arkansas, if I'm not mistaken. I was with a photographer, and the shooting had happened, I think, early in the morning, and we had traveled up to the university to see if we could speak with someone that was impacted. And I think we spoke with just a resident of that apartment complex who recalled hearing the shots and just as a student, and how this is kind of unheard of in this particular area. So I can recall the first story in Little Rock for sure.
What's it like? I mean, I've lived in Texas my whole life. What's it like going across the country and I assume that these different states you live in and cover the news. It's a different feel. I mean, what's it like trying to adjust?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways you could answer this. I mean, just from culturally to how a station runs and operates. But I've always been one to easily adapt to different areas and climates, not just in terms of weather, but of, as what I just said, different vibes of life and perspectives and political allegiances and religious emphasis. But yeah, it's been fantastic. I easily sink into San Antonio. It doesn't feel too much different from other places I've lived. I'd say Tucson, Arizona is the most, I guess, similar when it comes to it. I mean, I think it's been a lot of people look like me. On my mother's side, she's of Mexican heritage. My dad is a host of Europeanness, mainly English. And I grew up in Eastern Washington, where there is a sizable population of people that speak Spanish, from various Spanish-speaking countries. I don't know Spanish myself, so sometimes people come up and say, "Hey, they're speaking." Sorry, very minimal. But it's nice to be in a place where there's some familiarity, and I guess, just in terms of culture. I mean, the extent of food I like ranges, but I like Tex-Mex food, and I like medium rare steak with a mountain of garlic mashed potatoes. I guess when it comes to other aspects, like I love walking and running, finding great paths in town to routinely just exercise or just decompress. I mainly just have time to do that. It seems like on the weekends when I was working night side, I don't have to go until like 2 p.m. So I was able to get things done earlier in the day. And coming here, I work night side more often. So it was kind of an adjustment in that regard. In the world of TV news, you don't know really what shift you're going to be working on. You'll be tossed around, and I'm always willing to fill in when people are absent or need to provide additional help for coverage. I mean, I've helped on the early morning show several times, and that was kind of an adjustment because I didn't do it much in my previous market. I did it for like 6 months in Tucson, but it wasn't my cup of tea, I would say, just because of it seemed like the type of stories I did. They seemed to me more just lighthearted. Again, I'm a like I could be a light. I enjoy lighthearted stories, but I like more the hard news aspects. And when it comes to early morning news coverage, which I'm able to do plenty of that here in San Antonio, there's always some unfortunate situation that happens, a shooting or a car accident, etc.
Do you? I'm not talking about the actual station you worked at, but in all these different stops that you've had, around the country, is there a favorite city that you like the vibe, you like the people, the climate?
Yeah, I think Tucson. Between Tucson and, I mean, there's an amalgamation of places I really enjoy, but I think Tucson for me is, if I had to choose immediately, it would be there because I don't know, it was a good, wonderful environment. I enjoy the people of just the vibe of the community. The downtown isn't too massive. It's has a very young college vibe about it. I mean, I'm 29 now, but still, I played my clarinet for fun along the 4th Avenue pedestrian tunnel, which also had occasionally this, not a train, but some type of rail car that would go through. And on weekends, I would perform for fun and not for money, just because I didn't want to annoy my neighbors at my apartment complex with New Orleans jazz music. So I would play there on weekends, and it was well lit, and the colors changed. It was like a rainbow of colors that would alternate throughout the evening, and just people are very friendly. And that's where I got to, it took me some time to get the courage to even play and in a public setting like that. And some people would just stand and watch, get nervous. I just prefer the people that would walk and admire and perhaps drop a few bucks here and there. But it was, I think, playing in front of people like that developing that courage, maybe can also help me in my job, to be able to come up to people, especially for stories when we have to get members of the community, their perspectives on a topic we call in the business man on the street. I've heard other news directors or people in the business call it something else, not as much of a prettier term, but MOS being kind of useless. But it helped, playing the clarinet in front of people, develop this courage, I think was helpful for me, to come up to people and just talk to them like everyday people and not be nervous about it. I think you develop a thicker skin being in TV news, because when you do stories, sometimes not everyone's going to like you, and you'll do a story with someone that you perhaps admire, has been fantastic in the past, but when it comes to this more negative story, they got to realize, yeah, this is may not be as pleasing, but most folks, they understand that, and it's important to keep a professional relationship with individuals. You don't want to burn bridges. You don't want to seem too buddy with them, because there might be that, as I kind of was alluding to, might be stories where you got to ask tougher questions, that might put them in a more difficult spot. So
I want to talk a little bit about technology and how news gathering has changed. 25 years ago when I started, the station I was working at in San Antonio, they were editing on Super VHS tape. And, I started out in production, but I wanted to get into news and edit and shoot. So after the news, everyone's gone, I'd go and get some tapes and start practicing, teach myself the way the system worked and how to edit. And then when I felt I had a good grasp on that, I grab some cameras, go shoot some footage, and eventually, I did get into news. And I would hear guys back then talk about how back in the '80s they have these huge things that they have to put on their shoulder to carry the deck for the tape, and then have to big carry the camera. and then they ended up having needed shoulder surgery because they were just so darn heavy. And even back, when I started, those cameras were to me heavy. But now everything's it's lighter. You got high definition quality. You've got these computers that can do these amazing special effects, and I couldn't do back then. What do you think it would be like for you to have to, like, first of all, edit on tape and not have the advantages that we've got with computers now?
Yeah, I can't imagine working in those days and editing tape to tape. I was talking about with a photographer friend of mine at KENS about the days of editing in that way, and they're talking about it as if it's this relic of the past from decades ago. I guess it kind of is, but for me, it's just kind of unheard of. So the technology has certainly changed over the years and made it more streamlined for people that are starting out in the business. Because when you start out in TV news, most likely you're going to be what they call a multimedia journalist, one-man band, so many other terms. Or you're shooting, editing, and writing all yourself. You'll have assistants for live shots. But again, we could get into the topic of live shot safety in a bit, maybe. But it's changed for the better, I'd say. We have smaller cameras, but sometimes I prefer the bigger ones because they could do more than the smaller ones, especially when it comes to focus and zoom. But for mobility purposes, the smaller cameras are much better. And if you were to do a ride-along, for example, with law enforcement or a farmer, it's much easier to hold something that's maybe slightly bigger than your smartphone than a big kahuna of a contraption that you're going to be struggling with, which I did do a ride-along when I worked in Tucson with, I think it was the sheriff's office. I had the bigger camera, and it was a little bit more difficult to get the shots I wanted without feeling uncomfortable in the passenger seat trying to manage my way holding this massive camera.
Right.
But with the little cameras, are just using a combination of equipment, of GoPros, have unique perspectives. You could use your phone these days, especially when it comes to maybe getting for example, I've seen in the San Antonio market, especially, you don't have time, your photographer maybe doesn't have time to take the camera off to chase down a political official to ask him or her questions about something. So I think the smartphone will do the trick. And phones these days have some decent audio. It's good to have a steady hand. That's all it takes. So there's so many ways that people have been able to capture video and audio and turn it into a creative, attractive product that we see online and on air.
Right.
When it comes to editing, I've used so many editing softwares. Started out, remember back as a kid, I would put together videos of my video game gameplay. I used to play Halo 3. I still play it to this day. It's came out in 2007, and I still play it. So right. That's I'm pretty much addicted. But I would compile like montages of clips from my gameplay and use Windows Movie Maker, which I think was pre-installed on most PCs back in the day. I feel like Windows Movie Maker, the way it's changed, it's not as in depth. A lot of features seem to be missing. I think it's this age of trying to be more simple, perhaps. But I enjoyed the old, I forgot which version of it, but it was a version that I would use quite a bit. So I was editing back as a kid. But being in this business was the first, I think, in Montana, I think it was Final Cut 7 and Final Cut 10. And that was very easy to grasp. I think Final Cut 7, some with older versions tend to be better than the newer
Right.
ones. And then I used in Arizona something called Velocity, and some people nicknamed it atrocity because it had so many issues. But again, they're all pretty much the same. Avid, we learned that in school. I'm sure maybe you have touched Avid in your days. And then I use Adobe Premiere, have it on my personal computer, and that's what we use for day-to-day coverage at KENS. So it can be a lot to manage as a multimedia journalist, especially in deadline, anxiety-ridden situations where perhaps you're in Uvalde and maybe you're by yourself, or any other location that's far away and doesn't have reliable internet, and maybe there's a boatload of other journalists there to somehow affect the ability to send video back quickly. So you got to find a Starbucks or any other. There's this hotel in Uvalde I would go to quite a bit. But anyways, in general speaking, it can be difficult to manage all those things at once. So if you have the opportunity to be with a photographer to help edit and to help shoot your video, it's going to be a much better product. Though there are those, I know a few individuals that it looks like they're shooting with a photographer, but it's all themselves. Those people are very rare, though, I have to say. I very much admire their work, but I know that my work will always be much better with a photographer. But I enjoy the creative process. You have full creative control. I still find myself feeling a little hesitant to certain photographers. Did you get that? Because I don't want to offend them, make it feel like I'm offending them. But there are certain individuals that have been in the business for decades, and they're totally comfortable. You talk about what you want and have an idea, and they're already shooting stuff that I don't need to ask about. I'm like, fantastic. You develop a relationship with a photographer, and you begin to have an idea what each other has an eye for, and it makes it that much more enjoyable to work and come to work every day. Otherwise, you're just working by yourself, and I enjoy the solitude. But again, working with a photographer is something that I feel like should be emphasized more if stations have the resources to do so.
Stay tuned. On the next edition, we will continue with Zack Briggs from KENS 5.